Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Sunita. When we practice palliative medicine, we find a lot of time. I think this is, I think once or twice, definitely. Sometimes 3 times, sometimes four times, and sometimes 5, 6 times that a breathless patient has reached to your palliative medicine clinic or in the ward, and you most of the time you struggle that. How to make him comfortable when already all the treatment has been exhausted, and all if treatment is there, still the patient is with you and you want to handle that patient. So I am very happy that today Sunita is going to tell you how to approach a patient who is breathless. Dr. Sunita is a specialist medical officer palliative medicine at National Health Mission General Hospital, Ernakulam. She is also an honorary consultant research in Trivandrum Institute of Palliative Sciences and associated with Palliav India. She is locum consultant palliative medicine at Hot Doctors UK. She is global palliative care India lead at Wolfson Palliative Care Research Center UK. She is also an advisor cancer screening Karkinos Healthcare Private Limited. She is a I think I have seen her reviewing articles so well. She is also an associate editor of British Medical Journal, Supportive and Palliative Care. She is an excellent faculty of Impact, Head and Neck, India, and she is also doing her PhD from UK. At personal level, Sunita, whenever I have heard you have a thorough knowledge of the subject. You don't come to the podium or the stage when you don't have. You are an excellent speaker. You have full knowledge of the subject, and I'm very happy to say that today we will be able to get the most latest evidence-based approach to a breathless patient from Sunita. She is a quiet and very calm person, but very, very intelligent and excellent speaker. Sunita, go ahead, and I am happy there are 195 participants now. So Arun will take the question answer at the end, and we will announce a few more things after the lecture. Thank you very much. Sunita, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Sushma ma'am, for the kind introduction. And thank you for IAPC Academy for giving me an opportunity to be here. It's a pleasure and privilege to be here with all of you. So I'll start my session. I'll start by sharing the screen. Is it visible?
Yes, it is visible, Sunita. It's visible. Okay.
So as ma'am mentioned, breathlessness is a very important symptom, and most of you're all getting trained in palliative care or have experience of working in palliative care, must have seen lots of patients with breathlessness. And that's one of the reasons why IAPC Academy has probably given this topic another go. So this is the second session of the breathlessness patient. So what I'll do in today's presentation is I'll briefly give you a one-slide summary of the previous session we had on the same topic. Then we'll go on to a case study. So we'll have to make use of the knowledge we learned from the previous topics. So hope you all remember that session. And then so there'll be some questions which will be poll based in between. So Nisha will be launching that. I'll just briefly mention about maybe a bit more details on the non-pharmacological intervention and then pharmacological treatment, and conclude with the community management of breathlessness at end of life. So if you remember the session, it was taken by Dr. Gupta in the first series of IAPC Academy. It was lecture 9. So he taught you about the pathophysiology of dyspnea, what were the causes of dyspnea. We went through that. He mentioned the breathing, thinking, functioning model. We also touched upon chronic breathlessness syndrome. And Dr. Gupta mentioned lots of tools that is very valuable that you can use when you see a patient with breathlessness, including VOS scale, MMRC, modified box scale. He mentioned the investigations for how to approach a patient with breathlessness, cover the non-pharmacological techniques, and also the interventions. And he touched upon the opioids and breathlessness. So, if you haven't had a chance to go to the lecture, it's still available in the IAPC YouTube channel. So please go to that. It's a lecture 9. It was released in the website on September 2020. So we'll come to our patient. So we've got a patient called Mr. Kumar. He's a 65-year-old gentleman. He's an ex-smoker. He has a past history of diabetes and hypertension, and he's recently diagnosed with a stage 2 lung cancer. He's had his chemoradiation. He's now currently on follow-up. So he's come to your clinic with a history of shortness of breath and cough. His current symptoms began 3 days ago. Initially, it was upper respiratory tract infection, and then that progressed on to develop into a cough and shortness of breath. And but he has history of chronic morning cough, productive white phlegm, and has increased for the past 2 days. When you further question him for his past history, he complains of recurrent episodes in the past 4 years. And he has also smoked about 1 to 2 packets of cigarettes per day since the age of 20, and he only stopped when he was diagnosed with cancer. So that is our patient. So I'll introduce you to Mr. Kumar. And I'll get Nisha, if you can launch the first poll. The first poll, what do you think is the cause of Kumar's breathlessness?
Yes, Sunita ma'am, I have launched the poll. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll show you the scenario again. So that's Mr. Kumar. So what do you think is happening with his breathlessness? About 29% have voted, so I'm still waiting.
Yeah. Now 30%.
Okay. Okay, shall we just end the poll, Nisha?
Yes, yes.
So we've got about 53% of you answering as undiagnosed COPD, 27% saying it's radiation pneumonitis, 11% copulmonale, and 9% saying pulmonary embolism. What I would say is that, just close this poll.
Can I close the poll now?
Yes, Nisha, yes, thank you. I mean, you know, so the thing is, in Mr. Kumar's case, he definitely had chemoradiation, but we don't know when he had it. So whether we're not sure whether it's in the time of radiation pneumonitis, it can be an answer. But looking at the history, he's had this complaints for the past 4 years. It is copulmonale, again, no features of heart failure. It's not mentioned the history, and he can have a PE. You're right, but he doesn't have chest pain, and because it's got cancer, he can have a PE, but there isn't any other feature. So what I was thinking was probably he has got undiagnosed COPD, and that is contributing to his symptoms. And his cancer was diagnosed first, and then the COPD was diagnosed. So I'll just ask one more question about Mr. Kumar. So suppose you're suspecting him of COPD and you sent him for a spirometry test, now which is supposed to be the first test and diagnostic test for COPD, and his test has come back as post bronchodilator FE1 by FVC less than 0.7 and FE1 less than 80% and more than 50% of his predicted value, which actually indicates moderate COPD. So you were right in your judgment. He had COPD and is actually in a moderate state. Now, there were some tools mentioned in the last session, but which of the following assessment tools is used to decide on the treatment choice for Mr. Kumar? So is it a combined MMRC and COPD assessment test or CAT tool? Is it just a WAS scale, a box scale, or numeric rating scale? Nisha, could you please launch the second poll? Okay, we'll close the poll now, Nisha. Brilliant. About 74% of you have answered MMRC and COPD assessment test. So we'll just stop this poll. So we all know that spirometry is the first test to diagnose, and it looks like he's got about moderate COPD. So if his FE1 is less than 80% and more than 50% predicted, means moderate. If its FE1 is less than 50% and more than equal to 30% predicted, is severe COPD. And FE1 less than 30% predicted is very severe COPD. So how do you plan the treatment? So I just brush up on your MMRC. You know that MMRC is basically to assess this dyspnea. So you grade that into grade 0 is dyspnea only with 20 exercise. 1 is hurrying up, walking up a slight hill. 2, the person walks slower than the people of the same age because of dyspnea, and he has to stop when walking at own pace. 3 is a stops for breath after walking 100 meters, and 4 is too dyspneic to leave or breathless to leave the house. That is just for dyspnea, so it is not specific to COPD. So we've got something called a COPD assessment tool, assessment test, or the CAT test, where you've got specific symptoms for COPD and you grade accordingly. So the patient will be asking about cough, and you have to grade whether I never had cough as 0 and I cough all the time as at 5. Then about phlegm, you ask the question. Your chest feels tight all the time. And when I walk up the hill or flight of stairs, I'm not breathless or I am breathless. Depending on the specific symptoms for COPD, the COPD assessment test is done, or the CAT test is done. And you calculate the score depending on that. So you've got this a score based on MMRC and a score based on the CAT test. And then you decide on the treatment. So I'll go into details of how do you find the treatment after I launch the third poll. So we come to Kumar. So you assess Kumar with MMRC and a CAT test, and you've got a score of MMRC of 0 to 1, and CAT score is less than 10. But when you ask his question about his history, he has got more than 2 moderate exacerbations and more than 1 leading to hospital admission. So there is when we go for the treatment management of COPD, all this has to be asked, and depending on these 3 criteria, we put Kumar into group C. So suppose Kumar falls in group C, then which of these drugs is used to treat him specifically? And this was presented as a beautiful table by Dr. Gupta's presentation. So if you can launch the third poll, Anisha, please. Okay, we'll close the poll. So I'm actually sorry, that was actually a tricky question. So, but once you see the guidelines and once you see the table, it'll be more easy to understand. So most of you, so you've answered a short-acting bronchodilators, LABA, ICS, and only 4% have answered LAMA. LAMA is the correct answer. So we can just close the poll, Nisha, please. So long-acting muscarinic antagonist is the class of drugs that we start specifically for Group C patients, and I'll explain to you, I'll show the slide why. We can just close this page. So this is the table I was talking to you about, and this is from the GOLD guideline. I'll give you the reference to the guideline that's in the chat box. So it's a Global Initiative for Chronic Obstructive Lung Disease guidelines. So it is a combined COPD assessment approach in a group of patients according to the symptoms and the previous history of exacerbations. And symptoms you assess using the MMRC and the CAT scale. So you can see that they divide into Group A, Group B, Group C, and Group D. Group A patients are not very symptomatic. You can see the MMRC is 0 to 1, the CAT is less than 10, and the exacerbations are also not high. So only 0 to 1 exacerbation, no hospital admission. So they'll need a simple bronchodilator. Then you go to Group B, where the MMRC is high, so they're very symptomatic, and the CAT score is also high. But again, all these symptoms are not leading to a exacerbation, not leading to hospital admission. So there you give a long-acting bronchodilator. And then you go to Group C, where the symptoms are not very high, but what happens is each symptom, you end up getting an exacerbation and you end up going to hospital admission. So you give a LAMA for that. And LAMA is tiotropium, it's a long-acting muscarinic agent. And then the Group D patients, where you've got high symptoms, high CAT test, and more than 2 exacerbations leading to hospital admission. So you have to give all the drugs for them. And I've given you the name. So LABA example is of long-acting beta agonist, salmeterol inhaler. That's one of the example you can use. LAMA is tiotropium, and ICS, we all know it's a steroid, so fluticasone and budesonide. Now, if you can go to this GOLD guidelines, and obviously it will be more thorough when you actually go through. So I'll give you the reference. It's in the presentation, and we'll give the reference at the end of the slide, the chat. So think of Mr. Kumar. So any COPD patient, we've got a comprehensive approach to management of dyspnea in patients with advanced COPD. And this is given in our Oxford textbook also. So initially, when you start, you assess the magnitude of dyspnea. And as we mentioned, all these medications can be started, initiate and optimize the pharmacological therapies. One by one, you have to start them. You keep on assessing and following him up. And then once the symptoms get worse, so this is arrow shows the worsening of the symptoms. What happens? You go on to the non-pharmacological therapies. And the next step, you can go to the opioid therapy. So this is how we plan or treat a patient with advanced COPD. We come to Paul 4. So you're reviewing Kumar, and the following months, what happens is that you can see he's been started on all the medications. And so all the groups have been started. It's few months since you last saw Kumar. And then he comes to your clinic. He's very breathless and clinic despite all the medications. Then you assess the severity of breathlessness using an NRS scale, and you see that he scores 8 out of 10. He also vividly remembers episodes of worsening breathlessness and ending up in hospital following that, and is very, very anxious. He described his thought as, "Doctor, I fear dying without being able to breathe." So this is Kumar now. So we'll come to the next poll. What do you think is the cause of Kumar's breathlessness now? Is it acute exacerbation of COPD? Is it a chronic breathlessness syndrome, copulmonary or pulmonary embolism? Nisha, can I please have the next poll? Okay, we'll end the poll now, Nisha. So about almost equal have gone for acute exacerbation of COPD versus chronic breathlessness syndrome, slightly more for chronic breathlessness syndrome. So if you look at the history, he could be having an acute exacerbation, you're right. But the thing is, we haven't mentioned anything about him having any worsening cough, more productive of phlegm. So what are the three criteria? You should be more breathless than normal, more cough and more productive phlegm. So that is not there. And there's no other features of copulmonale or pulmonary embolism. So I would go with probably with chronic breathlessness syndrome, which you have heard in the last session. So we can just close the poll now. Right. So what is chronic breathlessness syndrome? It's one of those things that has come out quite recently, and there has been a number of papers about chronic breathlessness syndrome. This was a result of a Delphi process. So Delphi process is basically, lots of experts from the developing countries have come together, and they discussed the need to define a new syndrome in breathlessness. And this was agreed upon by, and it was actually voted upon using a Delphi process. And they all agreed that we need to define a new syndrome called chronic breathlessness syndrome, like the chronic pain syndrome. Why? And how do you define that? It's experience of breathlessness that persists despite optimal treatment of the underlying pathophysiology, and it ends in disability for the patient. So you have a patient with you who's got all the maximal medical treatment for whatever diagnosis they have. It can be COPD, it can be heart failure. They're on the maximal medical treatment for that, but still they come to your clinic and they're still breathless. So you don't know what to do about them. And that is what is labeled as the chronic breathlessness syndrome. And why is it important to know that? Because unless you recognize that symptom, unless you understand the importance, you won't do more trials on that. You won't try to help these patients, because unless you know there's a diagnosis like that, you don't know what to do. So it's basically to provide a framework for understanding, for documentation, and also to explore further on the symptom experience. So this was done. This Delphi process was done in the developed nations, and we didn't have any data from the low and middle income countries on this Delphi process. So we did a study, a similar Delphi study, or you can say it's a focus group discussion in our center in South India, where we got a group of doctors who are non-palliative care. So we got 15 physicians. They're working from oncology, palliative care, cardiology, and respiratory specialties got together. And we had a focus group discussion. There were 3 groups there, and about the same theme, about is there a need for a new syndrome? And what happened was we got, as a result, we got 3 major themes that came from this focus group discussion. First is impact. So everybody agreed that it is very, very important. It's a prevalent condition. It's got major impact on the patients, families, and physicians. That was the first theme. Second theme was the invisibility. So there's a therapeutic helplessness among the doctors. Most of the non-palliative care physicians felt that they know the patients are suffering, but they don't know what to do about it because there's a poor awareness, and they've got difficulty in managing the breathlessness. And the third theme was the purpose. Why do we need a new definition? So everybody agreed that we needed to foster the education regarding the assessment, management, and support service development and research. So we've got data from our country also regarding the need for a term for chronic breathlessness syndrome. So what is this therapeutic invisibility? Why do you think that this symptom is invisible? So if you ask a patient who's got chronic breathlessness syndrome, he might say, if you ask him, are you breathless? He might say no. But if you ask him a specific question like, what have you given up to avoid breathlessness? Then the answer will come. So based on this thought, there was another paper that came from Australia. This was a cross-sectional study. This was an online survey used in Australia, and among patients who were breathless. And they went to 3,000 adults, and out of that, they got about 583 people who had symptoms of breathlessness in the MMRC scale, at least 1 or 2. And they asked these questions. What have you given up? What activity have you given up to avoid breathlessness? And this was a question that was asked in the study, and you can see the results. So what they saw was that those who had about MMRC scale of 1, that means in the lower one, about 33% didn't have to give up any activity to manage the breathlessness. But when the MMRC scale worsened, became 2, about only 9% didn't have to give up any activity, and at 3% didn't have to give up. So what you can see is that High intensity sport was the one that was most commonly given up by the patient, something that they enjoy doing. They had to give up because they were breathless. So that's how they managed. Then came gardening, sexual activity, low intensity sport. So these were the things that came up in this study. So it was important to know that people are actually reducing the wide range of activities that they normally do because of the chronic breathlessness. And that's how the symptom becomes visible. A couple of words about importance of the symptom. This was again covered previously. It's very important. It's a prevalent symptom. You know that 75 to 87% of primary lung cancers have got breathlessness. And there was a study done among palliative care patients. About 5,000 patients were assessed. The reference is given in the slide. And you can see that the breathlessness, the symptom of breathlessness increased they had about 50% at 3 months before the death, which increased to about 65% at the time of death when they were following these patients. So it's a very, very common symptom. And absence of breathlessness was only recorded in about 10% of patients between the referral and the death. So you can see that it's very, very important. And this is under study in JPSM, which showed us the prevalence of breathlessness in all the conditions in cancer and non-cancer. And you can see that it's common in cancer as well as in HIV, heart failure, COPD, and CKD. So it's an important symptom. And the other importance of dyspnea is that it correlates with survival also. So that we've got a prognostic scale called the palliative prognostic score, which predicts a 30-day survival of palliative care patients. And what are the parameters you use in the palliative prognostic score? So you use a clinical prediction of survival. That is basically you look at the patient and clinically what is the judgment of the patient's survival. That has some score. The Karnofsky performance status comes in there, anorexia and dyspnea. So dyspnea is an important actually a predictor of survival in palliative patients according to this prognostic score. The other parameters are total white blood count and lymphocyte count. And we all know that dyspnea, once a patient becomes dyspneic, it brings about panic, the fear, anxiety, depression, and hopelessness. They've got a loss of control, and patient will feel there's an impending death to the patient. So that's another important thing to remember. This is a palliative prognosis score. So these are the scores. If the patient has got no dyspnea, they score 0. And if they have got dyspnea, they score 1. And accordingly, what you can see is that group A patients with a score of 0 to 5.5, the 30-day survival is more than 70%. And as the score worsens, the 30-day survival is less than 30%. I mean, the important thing is the clinical prediction of survival also, about weeks. When you look at the patient, do you think they're going to survive more than 12 weeks, 11 to 12 weeks? Like that, there's grading also. But the important thing to remember is that dyspnea is also an important symptom. So if you've got dyspnea, your score actually goes high and it's worse prognosis. So coming back to Kumar, so you've identified that Kumar has got chronic breathlessness syndrome. What would be your next step in managing Kumar's breathlessness? Is it oral morphine? Is it subcut midazolam? Is it non-pharmacological therapies, or is it oxygen inhalation? Can we have the poll 5, Nisha? I think it's poll 4. Yeah, poll 5 now. Yeah. What would be your next step in managing Kumar's breathlessness? Okay, we'll end the poll, Nisha. Please and share the results. So you've gone for oxygen inhalation, oral morphine, and non-pharmacological therapies, which has come as 32%. And I mean, morphine and non-pharmacological therapies, I would say, you can decide what you want to do, because it's not wrong in going for oral morphine first line if you don't have access to non-pharmacological therapies. I just want to remind you of the slide I showed you where, there's a step-by-step management where first you initiate non-pharmacological therapies. And once that is also not working, then you can actually start him on oral morphine. Oxygen inhalation, I haven't mentioned Kumar's saturation in the slide, so we don't know whether Kumar is hypoxic. So unless Kumar is not hypoxic, I wouldn't go for the route of oxygen inhalation. He could be hypoxic because he's got a moderate COPD and there's a chance, but then in that case, you'll have to refer him for assessment and then decide on oxygen inhalation, because we know that unless you know the oxygen level and without proper monitoring, if you put him on oxygen, there's a chance that he can go into retention and type 2 respiratory failure. So I wouldn't go straight away to oxygen inhalation for Kumar, but obviously with non-pharmacological therapy and oral morphine, depending on your availability, you can go for either of them. So the management of dyspnea, again, the specific management would be, there's a specific disease management. We covered this. Then we've got this non-pharmacological techniques, physical and psychological management. Pharmacological treatment, non-invasive ventilation, palliative sedation, and again, bit of ventilation was covered by Dr. Gupta, so I wouldn't be going into details of that. We've touched upon Kumar's specific disease management. So non-pharmacological interventions for breathlessness, what are the evidence for that? And this was a Cochrane review. This was done in 2008. We haven't had a Cochrane since then. So Cochrane review was actually a review of all the interventions, basically all the review of all the literature reviews. And what they found at 2008 was that breathing training, walking aids, neuroelectrical muscle stimulation, basically stimulate the muscles, because the patients are too weak to exercise. You use neuroelectrical muscle stimulation to stimulate the muscles, and chest wall vibration are the 4 non-pharmacological techniques that has got evidence-based according to Cochrane review. And this is published in 2008, because I think we have got lots of other studies coming up after that. Chest wall vibration specifically for it modifies respiratory sensations by activation muscles, spindles in the intercostal muscles, and it's useful for COPD and MNT. So this was according to the Cochrane review, but handheld fan, we had lots of discussion last session about handheld fan, and I think it's been popularly used now. There's lots of evidence coming for handheld fan, and the mechanism is unknown. Lots of, there are explanations for that. Basically, it's a cold air coming to your face. It's a stimulating the trigeminal nerve, which fools the brain into believing that the ventilatory flow is higher than it really is. So lots of theories about that, but we have got evidence now to say that it reduces the intensity of breathlessness in people living with chronic breathlessness. It speeds the recovery from an exercise-induced breathlessness. So patient is exercising and feels breathless. He can't get his breath back. Use a handheld fan. They recover quickly to their baseline. Enables greater levels of physical activity and reduces the use of beta-2 agonists. There's a qualitative study in which the patient has said that I have not been using my blue inhaler that much since I started using the fan. So this is given as a part of the breathlessness intervention service, and you can give a small handheld fan, battery operated. Ask them to hold it close to cheek, nose, and mouth, about 15 centimeters, 6 inches away. And so there's lots of evidence which has come after that. This study, which is a exploratory systematic review and meta-analysis. About 16 out of 78 studies and 11 RCTs were used, which compared oxygen versus medical air. So fan at rest and airflow is delivered as a cylinder, or medical air at rest, or airflow delivered as a cylinder medical air. All these was used in the studies, and what we found is that airflow appears to offer meaningful relief of chronic breathlessness. So it is definitely has got strong evidence to use this handheld fan. And it could be one of the reasons why, when patient comes with breathlessness and you start them on oxygen, even if they're not hypoxic, they feel better. And this is one of the theories, because again, you get the cool air coming to your face. So, but obviously oxygen is actually a drug. So rather than giving them a drug like oxygen, why don't you give them a handheld fan, which can help them with their symptoms. I'll remind you about the breathing, thinking, and functioning model. This is covered in the last session, but it's important to remember in the case of Kumar also. So you can see that Kumar has got recurrent episodes of breathlessness. So what is happening? What did he tell you? Doctor, I'm scared of dying. I'm scared of dying without getting any air. So come to the thinking thing. What is it? He has got thoughts about dying. He's got misconception, and he's got this memories and past experience where in previous experience when he was breathless, he ended up going to an ICU, getting admitted to the hospital. He doesn't want that to happen. So there's anxiety, distress, feelings of panic. So when you become breathless, next time he becomes breathless, he thinks he's going to die. So his anxiety worsens. That is one cycle we need to crack because of panic attack. Second one is the breathing as such, because these patients can't take enough breath. They're breathing so fast, this inefficient breathing, they can't take enough breath. So what happens is that the respiratory rate goes up, they use axillary muscles of respiration. So we need to cut that, we need to train them. We have to do some breathing training for them. And that's how we break that cycle. And third is a functioning. So what happens when a person becomes breathless? They don't do anything. If you move, they become more breathless. So what happens? The muscles become deconditioned. So the limb and chest wall muscles and axillary muscle becomes deconditioned. So what happens is that then they tend to isolate more. And that is like another vicious cycle. So that is a third cycle we need to break. Unless we break all these 3 cycles, we won't be able to manage that breathlessness. So I'll just quickly go through that. So this is something called a calming hand technique. You can actually get a printout of this and give to a patient or ask them to look at their hand. Okay. So this is only used when patient has a panic attack coming. So suppose this patient who, it might not be an infective exacerbation of COPD. It could be just breathlessness coming, but they'll be thinking about their ICU admission. So they start panicking. So what do you tell them? Ask them to look at their hand and look at the thumb, which is recognition that you're going to have a panic attack. So think about that. And then the first finger, sigh out, take a deep breath out. Ask them to sigh out. The next one is inhale gently. So take a deep breath in. That's the middle finger. Inhale gently. And then next, look at that ring finger and ask them to exhale gently. And the last step is stretch the hand and relax. So as soon as the patient should be taught to do this when they're having a panic attack. So you have to train them when they're normal. So you give all these aids to them, tell them that, this is what happens if you get a panic attack, you recognize that, you do all these steps, you try to bring your breath down, you stretch your hand and relax. So that is something called a calming hand technique, which can be tried, okay, and should be taught to the patient when they're well enough to, have that. So other breathing techniques are there. So one is called a relaxed tummy breathing or breathing control, where you teach the patient how to breathe low, slow, relax, and let go. So why is that important? So when the patient has an acute exacerbation, they're breathing very, very fast. They do. That's how they breathe, isn't it? So we need to teach them how not to breathe like that. They have to unlearn what they've been doing for some time. So what are the 3 R's of relaxed tummy breathing? You keep your hand on your tummy and you say, rise the tummy as you breathe. And you try to take a deep breath in and rise the tummy as you breathe in. Relax your breath out. You rest and wait for the next breath to come. Rather than just breathing very fast, you have to wait for the breath to come. And you teach this patient, you ask them to practice relaxed tummy breathing when they're not breathless for 10 minutes at a time, at least twice a day. So this has been exercise that they do when they're not breathless, at least 10 minutes. They have to practice doing this. So they train their body to recover from the breathlessness, usually after an activity or a panic. And they can do it at least twice a day. And the one is breathe in rectangle. This also you can take a printout and give to patient. They can put it in front of their, in the bed with the wall they're facing. So what is it? You start breathing out from one corner of the rectangle, the longer, the length of the rectangle. So one corner to the other corner, you move your eyes from one corner to the other corner. And the time taken for you to move the eyes from one corner to the other corner on the length is the time taken to breathe out. So you breathe out prolonged. And then you reach the other corner and you come to the short side or the width and you breathe in, isn't it? So a longer breath out, and then you follow your eyes from one corner to the other corner, you breathe in. Similarly, breathe out and breathe in. So it's a breathe a rectangle. You ask the patient to practice this at home. So they are able to teach themselves how to do a prolonged breathing out and breathing in. Third one is recovery breathing. So this is a patient is extremely breathless and they are panicky. They are unable to use relaxed tummy breathing. You have got the 3 F's of recovery breathing. So what do you use? You ask them to take a fan. So immediately take a fan. They do a forward lean position. The position was discussed in the last session. So you do a forward lean position and you focus on long and relaxed breath out. That is called a recovery breathing. So this also can be taught to the patient if they can't use the first one that was taught, 3 R's of recovery. And pursed lip breathing, this was again discussed last time. So it's breathing onto the in through the nose and out to the narrowed lips. So one of the breathing techniques that you can actually explain by saying that how do you smell a flower and blow a candle. So you smell a flower and you blow a candle. So the expiration should take twice the time of inspiration. And the patients do this themselves, isn't it? You can see patients doing a pursed lip breathing in COPD or emphysema that supports their airways, which allows the air to leave the lungs more easily. So you relax the neck and shoulder muscle and breathe in for 2 seconds through your nose, keep your mouth closed, and breathe out for 4 seconds. So breathing out should be twice more than the breathing in, prolonged expiration. I'll also conclude one more technique, which is the active cycle of breathing technique. And this is a technique which is helping to clear the mucus of the lungs in 3 phases. The first phase helps you to relax the airways. Second phase is to get the air behind the mucus and clear the mucus. And the third phase is help to force the mucus to your lungs. So this is, I'll show with a small video. So what I'll do is I'll stop the share now and I'll share with the video clipping. Okay.
It is a 3-phase cycle.
Is it audible?
The first phase is breathing control. Place your hand on your stomach and take a relaxed breath in through your nose and a relaxed, gentle breath out through your mouth. You want to be looking not to expand into the chest, but to expand into the stomach on the breath in. If you find on the breath out it is difficult with an open mouth, you may prefer a pursed lip breath. Repeat this for 5 times. After the 5th, move on to phase 2, the thoracic expansion exercise. Here, place your hands onto your rib cage. Take a longer, deeper breath in through the nose, and then open the mouth and take a gentle, long breath out through the mouth. During this phase, you're looking to get the movement of the ribs out, like so, and then come back in again on the breath out. Again, on the breath out, if you find it difficult with an open mouth, purse your lips together and this will make it easier. After the 5th, you can either go back to phase 1, the breathing control, or move on to phase 3, the forced expiratory technique. Here, you can mimic steaming up a window or mirror by using your hand. You take a long breath in through the nose and then open the mouth to huff out. And again, if you feel you can do it without using the visual aid of your hand, you can continue the practice. You can do it by taking a smaller breath in through the nose and a longer huff out through the mouth, or a longer breath in through the nose and a short, quick huff out through the mouth. At this point, you may feel the need to cough and clear.
So I hope that was clear. So I'll just go on to the presentation again. Okay, so so that was the active cycle of breathing technique. So there's breathing control. So she has shown the 3 steps of doing that. First, you do the breathing control to relax the airways. You breathe into the nose and out to the mouth, and you have to place one hand in your stomach as you breathe. So basically, this whole idea is to, help us to cough, help the patients to cough out the phlegm, and it's useful for bronchiectasis patients. There's lots of secretions present. You cast the air behind the phlegm, and the final step, you actually do the huffing and coughing, huffing or huff coughing. So where the air comes behind the phlegm and it's coughed out. So chest expansion, the second step of that, you're breathing deeply and breathe out without forcing the air out. You do this a couple of times and then come to the last step of huffing or huff coughing, where it's a forced expiration technique, which will help move the mucus out the lungs. And all this was shown in the video. So if you get a chance, please go to that video again. The link will be given to you. So Pharmacological management, a word about that I mentioned about oxygen. You try to give humidified oxygen. Only it's ideal to check the oxygen levels if they have got longer prognosis, and you monitor the level and carbon dioxide level before you continue the treatment. Small word about nebulized furosemide. This is given in our Oxford textbook, but there isn't much evidence. But some evidence is there, not very much, on using nebulized furosemide to relieve dyspnea because of airway diseases. But it's not to be of proven benefit in cancer patients. So what you do is you use 20 milligram of furosemide in 3 ml of normal saline and use for nebulization. And it's seen to provide some relief within 20 to 30 minutes, and it can last up to 4 hours. And it's got some evidence in COPD, mainly because it's supposed to be enhancing the pulmonary receptor activity, and it suppresses the pulmonary return activity and cause and vasodilation. So that is the mechanism behind that. So it's only for COPD patients. You can try that, and there are ongoing trials for this also, but not proven for cancer patients. Right, you come back to the poll again. So you referred Kumar for pulmonary rehabilitation facility, which was able to provide the multidisciplinary care for Kumar's COPD, including breathing exercises, dietary advice, and psychosocial support. His respiratory nurse has referred him back to your care. So Kumar has gone for his non-pharmacological. Now the nurse has referred him back to your care for starting of opioids. So can we have the next poll, Anisha, please? Which opioid has the best evidence in the management of chronic breathlessness syndrome? Is it morphine, is it oxycodone, fentanyl, or all of the above? I'm asking for the best evidence in the management of chronic breathlessness syndrome. Okay, we'll just end the poll and share the results, Nisha, please. So about 67% of you have said that morphine has the most evidence, and 17% feels all of the above. So actually, morphine is only opioid that has got the most evidence in chronic breathlessness syndrome. I know there are a few slides about nasal inhaled fentanyl, and oxycodone definitely doesn't have an evidence at all. So you go with morphine, and morphine is the simplest drug that's available, and that has got the maximum evidence. You can start with oral morphine. The dose was discussed last time. So usually you start with you can start with immediate release morphine, 2 to 3 milligram 4 hourly, and you can titrate according to response, and then change to a long acting morphine preparation. I won't go in details of benzodiazepine. Benzodiazepine is only indicated when the patient has got panic attack. So if you think that Kumar is having breathlessness and then having a panic attack, you can try a low dose of benzodiazepine for him. This is also covered in the last session. If you're going for sustained release morphine, what we say is that you start with 10 milligram dose and titrate it weekly, because sustained is actually a longer acting one. So you don't titrate immediately, because what you've seen is that even if the symptom doesn't get better initially, the trials have shown that they settle within a week's time. So I'll give you a couple of evidence to show that. So you titrate weekly by about 10 milligram, and the maximum dose is 30 milligram. Always prescribe a laxative along with that, and warn the patient about the potential side effects of drowsiness. And also, sometimes there's a risk of addiction also. We're not going to high dose here, but always warn the patients about the risk of addiction. I'll quickly go through these two questions. What's the maximum dose of sustained release morphine in 24 hours to manage chronic breathlessness syndrome? Nisha, can we have the next poll, please? I wouldn't give much time for this because it is already mentioned. So poll 7. Okay, we'll close the poll and share the results, please. So 47% of you have mentioned that 30 milligram is the maximum dose. So that's the correct answer. According to all the trials that have been so far being done, you only need up to 30 milligram, and more than that, usually the patient becomes better after that. Otherwise, they stop responding. So usually we haven't gone for higher dose than that. Even though in clinical practice, if patients are already on a higher dose for pain, then people suggest giving an extra dose of morphine. That is the clinical practice. I'm sure what they've done all in trials are mostly patients or opioid naive patients having pure breathlessness. So I don't think I couldn't find any papers where they should do the combined one. But in clinical practice, you could do differently in pain. But in breathlessness alone, trials have shown that 30 milligram is the maximum dose. Next poll: what percent of patients with chronic breathlessness syndrome will not benefit from opioids? Is it 1/3? Is it half, 2/3, or 3/4? So what we have seen again in trials is that all the patients do not benefit. So can we have the next poll, Nisha, please? So what percent of patients with chronic breathlessness actually do not benefit from opioids? Okay, we'll end the poll, Nisha, please, and share the results. So 62% have got it right. So 1/3 of the patients will not benefit from opioids for managing chronic breathlessness. And that's the case, there's no point in continuing, you just have to stop it. And this is the paper which actually determined the dose as well as the how much benefit was there. It's a once daily opioid for chronic dyspnea. It's a dose increment and pharmacovigilance study. For this study aimed to determine the minimum effective dose, once daily dose. And what they did was they did a 10 milligram sustained release morphine was given. And in those people who didn't respond, they increased by 10 milligram each week to a maximum of 30 milligram. And they withdrew the participants if there wasn't either there were side effects or they didn't respond to maximum dose. So they decided 30 milligram as the maximum dose, and they withdrew the patient after that. And for those patients who had a 10% improvement in dyspnea, they actually got them to the phase 4 trial for the effectiveness study at that dose trial. And the outcome of this trial was that the response rate was 62%. That's how this 1/3 didn't respond came. So 62% of patients responded to the opioid. And in those who responded, 70%, the response was at 10 milligram. So 70% of patients who had a response to opioid responded at the minimum dose of 10 milligram was enough for them. So that is the common dose that given. And what you have seen is that in those patients who went to the pharmacovigilance or the phase 4 trial, 1/3 of patients continue to have a benefit after 3 months. So those who responded was taken to the longer trial. And what you found was that 1/3 patient actually continued to derive some benefit. But the minimum, most of the patient actually responded to 10 milligram. So what they concluded from this trial was that 10 milligram of sustained morphine once daily is safe and most effective dose for the people to respond. We come to a final poll. So now it's been a few months later, and you've seen Kumar again in the inpatient unit, and he had acute infected extracellular COPD. He got admitted. But meanwhile, what happened was that his cancer also recurred, and he's got distant metastasis. The treating oncologists have not offered any further treatment for Kumar. Now, Kumar is right now on oxygen. He's on IV antibiotics and steroids. In spite of all this, it's continuing to be very, very sick, and he's not able to complete sentence. In the past 1 year, he's had a number of hospital admissions, and it was prolonged admission. He was in ICU for months, and then he went back home. His family members are all with him. They're very, very upset. They're distressed seeing Kumar is suffering, and they begged him to be kept comfortable. Kumar is also very, very fed up. He's expressed a wish to go home. And when you had an earlier conversation with him, he said that he doesn't want to die in hospital. He wants to go home. So what will you do? Can I have the next poll, Nisha, please? So will you transfer him to ICU for intubation or mechanical ventilation? Will you transfer him to ICU for a non-invasive ventilation or BiPAP? Will you start non-invasive ventilation in the ward? Or will you start him on morphine, midazolam infusion? It's a poll 9, yeah. morphine midazolam infusion subcutaneously in the ward, or is it none of the above? Will you do anything else differently? So you wouldn't do any of these options, and you have got something else in your mind. If you actually go for none of the above, then I would like you to maybe in discussion tell me why you went with option also. Okay. Okay, can we stop the poll, Nisha, and share the results, please? So, I think there is no right and wrong answer for this question. This is an opinion-based question. That's what I personally feel. And I think everybody have got different opinion on this question. And you could be right. So if it's not a thermal event, so some people, actually 8% of the audience feels that he has to be transferred to ICU for intubation mechanical ventilation. 20% feel that you can transfer him to ICU for a non-invasive ventilation. 17% feels that you can start NIV in the ward. 29% feels that you can give him morphine midazolam infusion subcutaneously in the ward, and 26% wouldn't agree to any of these options, and they've given a none of the above option. So maybe in the end of the discussion, if you can, end of my session, you can unmute the people who went for none of the above can unmute and tell why they went for, or what option would they go for this for Kumar. And I think it is an opinion based. It depends on what all facilities you have. It depends on your conversation with the family. So I'll just move on. So I have decided to give him morphine midazolam infusion subcutaneously in the ward with the aim of sending him home. So how do you do terminal breathless? So it looks like, to me, he looks like probably Kumar is reaching his end of life. He's got a metastatic cancer also. So that scenario is made a bit more easier that way. And, he's got lots of admissions. He's coming to end stage COPD. So, and he has clearly expressed a wish to go home. So what you can do is, if he's really breathless, sometimes oral morphine won't work. So you can try subcut morphine for him. So you can give him morphine subcutaneously 2 milligram, maximum up to 6 doses in 24 hours. And if he's very, very anxious, you can give a benzodiazepine. So here we go for the subcutaneous route. You go for midazolam as a bolus, and you can add that to his infusion. And we go for subcutaneous route. One is it is less traumatic, and the second is if you want to send Kumar home, you can actually start a subcutaneous infusion and send him home. And if it's breathlessness, you increase the dose of morphine and midazolam in the driver, probably with a double effect of palliative sedation. But you explain that to the family that is the intent. The intent is not to sedate him completely, but the intent is to control his symptoms, and then that might have a principle of double effect, and that might end up him being sedated. So what are subcutaneous infusion devices? These are commonly used in the West for symptom management in palliative care, and you can manage any number of symptoms using this device. And when other routes are inappropriate or ineffective, so end of life care, the people can't solo, it's inappropriate to put them on NG2 feeding. For them, you can start subcutaneous route just for medications, or IV is inappropriate, you can start subcutaneous. And all the medications that we commonly give at end of life in palliative care can be given by the subcutaneous route. These are the two pumps that is used again in the West. You've got a McKinley, T34 McKinley syringe driver, and you've got a Grace-P syringe driver. And this is used both in hospitals and communities. So district nurses go to the community, they fill the syringe for 24 hours. This you can combine drugs, up to 4 drugs can be given this syringe. Suppose the patient has very bad symptoms in the community, you can give morphine, midazolam, haloperidol for agitation, restlessness. You can give nausea, vomiting, metoclopramide. Any number of drugs can be given, and they mix with normal saline. You give those 24 hours. District nurses will have to visit the patient daily at their home. They change the syringe driver. every 24 hours. Now, this is not, some units have this in India, I think, but it's very, very expensive and we can't afford it. So what we have done, or what in our institute, I'll just quickly mention that also, elastomeric pumps are balloon pumps that traditionally been used to deliver chemotherapy and antibiotics to patients at home via the intravenous route. And we have used these pumps to give medicines to the subcutaneous route. So this is an elastomeric pump. You can see a small tube in the center is where the medicines get filled in. And once it's filled in, that it becomes like a balloon. It works with the principle of by gravity and by vacuum pressure. And this can be given as a subcutaneous route under the skin. So you connect either butterfly needle, or you can even connect the cannula tube, and you can deliver these medications to that. This is a poster we did of using this infuser pump, and it was presented at one of the IOP cons. And here we use this for patients with bowel obstruction. When we want to manage the symptoms at home, we fill these medications in the pump and send them home, and the bystanders had come to refill it. Or a thermal agitation in centers, we either send them some patients to their local hospital because they don't have a syringe pump there, or we even have sent patients home for pain management. Everything we have tried, and there's a list of patients we have covered with that. So I'll just conclude by mentioning one more thing. This is an interesting YouTube session on interventions interventions in intervention pulmonology and palliative medicine. This talk was given by Dr. Rajani Surendra Bhatt. Most of you few of you at least might know her. She is an interventional pulmonologist with a special interest in palliative care. I'll give the link in the chat. It's a very, very interesting YouTube session, about 23 minutes. Please go through that when you get a chance, and it will tell you about how pulmonology and palliative medicine can work together. Also, water intervention. Some of this was covered by Dr. Gupta in his session, but others, water interventions you can do for pulmonology and palliative care together. So I'll conclude with my take-home messages. Dyspnea is an important symptom and it's a prognostic indicator. We need to have a careful patient assessment for the cause, look for early non-pharmacological interventions, and opioids have a role in symptom control. We need further research for chronic breathlessness syndrome. Thank you very much for listening, and we can take questions now.
So thank you very much, Sunita, for an excellent overview, evidence-based approach to a breathless patient. It was an excellent overview. You were having so much of literature, so many papers, and I'm afraid we have overshooted time. So Arun, if there are a few burning questions, important questions, we can take it for 10 more minutes. So we will have, I think we will have to finish, and then in that case 7:40, and we understand that many of you have to go for work. So if you want, you can leave. But before Arun starts question, I just want to announce two things, that we will be breaking this second lecture series from today. This is the last lecture of the second series. We will give you 2 weeks break, and we will start on third week. That is, the third week will come on 26th of July. And this time lecture series will be more interesting. Then, like we have covered basics, we have covered all the symptoms. So we will try to make it more interdisciplinary. So please don't forget to join after third week of from now. So take break for 2 weeks, go for holidays on Monday if you want to go, and you can join on third Monday, that is on 26th of July, 6:30 again. One more thing I want to tell you, for all, because today there are the maximum participants I have seen, almost 350 were there. So only 10 are remaining right now. I just want to tell you that half of you must not be a IAPC member. So please join membership, because there are a lot of benefits of becoming member. The biggest benefit is that you will be able to access all these IAPC lecture series lecture. Second benefit, you will be able to get the reduced registration in the conference. Third benefit is that now onwards you will be able to get a scholarship or travel grants of your attending conferences. Fourth biggest benefit is you will be able to choose or elect member or president or secretary in future of your choice. So you will be able to attend GBM, and you will be able to you will have voting rights. So please join IAPC. It's very, very nominal. It's one time you can join lifetime membership, or you can join yearly membership. Now Arun, please go ahead with the question answer for 5-10 minutes, and then Thank you very much, Sunita. This was an excellent lecture. Arun, please go ahead. Arun, are you there?
Thank you, Sunita. Yes, I'm there. Sunita.
Yeah.
Only one question from Dr. Stan about the family driver. Would you like to say anything on that?
The family driver. Dr.
The
Stan?
series, kind of series.
Yes, yes, sir. So I've read your paper. I think Dr. Stan has done this paper on IGPC on family driver, where you give, correct me if I'm wrong, sir, basically you give this bolus dose to the patient's family to give them boluses at home, because we didn't have infusion devices, so you're correctly right. And that's what we do in the community. And actually, for all practical purpose, probably that's what we still can do, because the pumps are about 1,800 rupees for a pump. So the way I justify that is, if you have a patient coming to a private hospital who has to get admitted for an infusion, and it's a 7-day pump is 1,800. So the cost of admission for 1 day is the 1 day pump is 250 rupees. The cost of admission for 1 day is more than that. So people who can afford, suppose they buy a pump and you do symptom management at home, then that is justifiable. For patients who can't afford, and unless your service can't provide a pump for them, so in GH we have actually got some pumps with us, and we can provide free of cost. But if the patient can't, you said obviously then you have to go for the family driver that Stan has mentioned. That's a good paper in IGPC, where you put a subcut needle in, you tease the family, give the boluses to them, you tell them what dose to administer for what symptom, and the family does it. So thank you, Stan. And you want to add something that?
No, it's very simple and can be taught easily, and you don't have to give separate boluses. You can put it all in one syringe, same syringe that you put on a syringe driver.
Okay, yeah.
Only thing is, instead of the technical aspect of pushing the pump, for 24 hours, here you're doing it intermittently, just like your oral morphine, every 4 hourly, regularly. The same way, the family will just give 1 ml of that combination. And it works. We have done it for more than almost 25 years. And it really works. It's very simple. And the beautiful thing is the family is totally involved, and they are there talking with the patient, and they can skip a dose if necessary. That's another important thing. I have seen in the UK, when I'm working with the syringe drivers, the patients are so, gaunt, they're almost like dead, it's just people are waiting for them to die, kind of, whereas in this kind of thing, you can skip a dose. If you feel that the person is too knocked off, and so because families like that little interaction, little squeezing of the hand, little, so I think overall, if I have a choice, I will go for the family driver. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, sir. Thank you for that.
Arun, next.
That's all, Sunita.
So I don't know, have we got time for anybody? So, in this last poll, a few of them went for none of the above. So would anybody would like to say why they didn't choose any of those options? If you would like to unmute and say. So they wouldn't go for some other option they're thinking of. So what were they thinking of? Or maybe just none of the above, because some MCQs, none of the above is the answer. So maybe that's why. I don't know, a lot of people went for none of the above. So I'm thinking they've got another answer.
Hello, home care, home care.
Okay, yeah. So, okay, sir.
Home palliative care, right.
Yeah. I think my option, I should have changed to start the infusion and send them home. So what I was trying to say was, you'd start at the hospital, then send them. Okay, that's fine, sir. Thank you. Yeah, definitely, because Kumar wanted to go home, isn't it? Yeah. Sure.
Arun, are there any other questions?
No, madam, there are no other questions.
Okay, then. Thank you very much, Arun. Thank you, Sunita. Thank you, Nisha and Archana. And thank you, everyone. Almost 350 people joined Sunita today. And it was an excellent overview with all evidence possible in the world. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
See you after 3 weeks. Okay?
Sure. Okay,
see you after 3 weeks with a lot of new insight of the palliative medicine. Thanks a lot.